Do you think that the 1960s are completely irrelevant to you right now? Well, just have a think again. What I'm going to actually look at now is I'm just going to have a look at some news articles from back in the 60s and just compare them with events that are happening around the world today. Now, the first one I want to look at is the assassination of JFK. Now, this happened on the 22nd of November, 1963. JFK, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and everyone who is alive today will be able to remember where they were when they heard the news of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Following that, in the 60s, we saw the killing of Bobby Kennedy. That was in, I think, in the late 60s. I think that was about 68. And also there was the Malcolm X assassination. He was a political activist. I think that was in about 1965. And then also Martin Luther King, or Martin Luther King Jr. Now, he was a civil rights activist, and he was assassinated in I think that was about 68. It wasn't long, I believe, after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Now, of course, Bobby Kennedy was the younger brother of JFK. He had been the Attorney General under John Kennedy's presidency, and I believe that he was in the process of, he was in a race at that stage, I think for the presidency. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, when I compare it to sort of what's been happening this year, the first thing that we've seen is the shooting of Melissa Hortman. Now, she was a state representative in Minnesota, and then her husband was also killed in that same shooting. And of course, then there's been more recently the Charlie Kirk assassination. There's been several attempts on the president in over last year during the presidential lead up to the elections. So even though the news was, this sort of thing was going on back in the 60s, it's still going on now in 2025. Now, this is political violence. It's not a new thing in America. It's been going on for decades. And it's almost like it's, oh gosh, this political violence, it's never happened before. Yes, it has, right back in the 1960s. That's like, 7 decades ago. Now, following on from that, we look at the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement, that took place sort of between about 1954 and 1968. And that was aimed to abolish legalised racial segregation and discrimination and disenfranchisement. Now, this saw the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1965, as well as the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Now, in the USA at the moment, when you come to the 2025, we're starting to see now people are being arrested, targeted, based on the colour of their skin and their race. Reports that the voting system is being changed to the detriment of minorities, and a particular slant on a racial bias. Now, this is being done by withdrawing some of the congressional districts. That's being done in, I think it was in Texas. It's being carried out. They've changed the districts in Texas. And of course then the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, I think he's in the process of getting the same thing done in retaliation in California. Also, there's a push by the current administration to do away with mail-in voting. Now, mail-in voting, that there is particularly detrimental to minorities and people in rural areas that can't always get to the polls on the day of polling. And so this certainly puts this particular section of the population at risk. And of course, that particular area of population are not particularly likely to vote for the current administration. So this is being done basically to stack the odds in favour of the current administration and to the disadvantage of minority groups. And in the process, this gives him the ability to unravel the progress made by the civil rights movement over the last 7 decades. So what was happening in the 60s, the news items, is now sort of very current back again in 2025 as the current administration is trying to reverse a lot of those things that took place. Also happening in the 1960s, on the 26th of June, I think 1969, man landed on the moon. And I remember being at work on this particular day and all the staff crowding around a radio. Now this is in New Zealand, so the daytime difference was probably a bit out from what it was in America. But I remember us all crowding around the radio waiting for the touchdown when we heard the famous words of Neil Armstrong, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And because the only way we could sort of see that in those times was we'd sit there and listen to it on the radio. We'd get a direct broadcast. And of course now how that relates to current times, I mean, we're looking now back in the 1960s. And now we're looking at Elon Musk. He's saying that he wants to have the planet Mars populated within 25 years with up to 1 million people. So that's, even though it's 7 decades, it's a huge progress, and it's a fairly high expectation, I would think, considering, okay, there's been such an advance in technology, but I mean, who's going to want to go and live on Mars? Who would want to leave our wonderful planet and go and live on Mars? I really don't know. But that's what Elon Musk has got planned. So that's the comparison with the 1960s compared to current day. And of course, then we've got the women's liberation movement. Now, this was very important during the 60s and the 70s. The women's liberation movement was very active in trying to push for gender parity. And one of the biggest achievements that was considered at the time was the passing of the Roe versus Wade ruling in 1973, which enabled women then to have an abortion without excessive government assistance. Now, from 1973, that's gone on now for 50 odd years. So what we've seen now in the last couple of years, I think back in 1922, we saw that Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. Now this is a huge eroding of women's rights and eliminating their right to have an abortion. Now I can't think, when I think about the progress of the world in so many areas, but unfortunately with America I can see that there's been this turn back the clock, especially with civil rights and with women's rights in the women's liberation movement. Now, women fought hard in those years, and it was a very difficult time. But of course now here we're seeing, 50 odd years later, the clock's been turned back. So when I'm looking at news articles of the 1960s, just sort of looking at 4 of them there, and comparing them with what's happening today in 2025, we might think there's been a lot of progress, but in a lot of cases there's been a lot of steps backwards. So those times we may consider the news items in the 60s as being fairly irrelevant, but they weren't. they weren't irrelevant. They were important in their day, and they survived. A lot of those rulings survived for many, many years, decades. But now, of course, we're seeing the clock being turned back, which is a shame. And I just wonder where it's going to end up. Let's hope there's not too much turning back of the clock. Okay, that's my thoughts on these. So, but just remember, when you look back in history of things that have happened, don't sort of dismiss them as being irrelevant, as being events that happened way back then, because a lot of them are very relevant to what's happening today. A lot of blood, sweat and tears went into passing laws by people who did it for the betterment and for the good of minorities and for women, just now to see a lot of it being turned over, which is really sad. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. If you have found this a bit interesting, please give me a like, share, make a comment if you'd care to. If you'd like to subscribe to my channel, I would be most appreciative. And from here, I will say, take care, everybody. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.